Hi, everybody. I'm Pierre Bouvard, Chief Insights Officer here at the Audio Active Group at Cumulus Media in Westwood One. And what happened when a major nasal and allergy remedy used AM/FM radio this past winter? The marketer wanted to examine the impact that radio could have on its brand equity. Things like awareness, brand favorability, consideration, and actual usage. The study conducted by Quantilope had four key findings. First, audio is the ideal media platform for cold remedies, for nasal treatments, for allergy treatments. Heavy podcast and AM/FM radio listeners are far more likely to be aware of and use all of the brands in the category. But AM/FM worked. Those exposed to the radio campaign exhibited much stronger brand equity, things like awareness, favorability, ad recall, consideration, and usage, versus those that were unexposed. Now, interestingly, while TV spend for the nasal allergy relief category dwarfs audio investment by 10 to 1, brand equity and usage underperform among heavy TV viewers. Surprisingly, brands that strongly advertise on TV actually have greater awareness among heavy audio listeners than among heavy TV viewers. Well, what's going on here? Well, what we discovered through the data is that the heavy audio consumers, heavy podcasts and heavy radio listeners, are much bigger users of the category, all of the brands, than the TV users. So it's audio is just a much better platform for this category because they're much bigger users. So the Quantilope study was conducted towards the end of the cold and flu season this past March. Quantilope surveyed 1,000 nationally representative Americans over the age of 35, and the study probed brand equity for all of the major brands in the category, as well as creating media segments such as heavy podcast listeners, heavy radio listeners, heavy TV viewers, etc. So we're going to look at the brand equity, the awareness, familiarity, favorability, consideration, and usage in this brand scorecard matrix with the brand equity measures across the top from left to right, and then the heavy media segments down the left, the heavy radio listeners, heavy podcast listeners, heavy TV viewers, and then the overall study, which was all Americans over the age of 35. So let's see what the scorecard reveals. And what we see is that across every single measure of brand equity, the audio listener outperforms. They outperform TV by a mile, and they also outperform the total US average. And so when you look at things like familiarity, folks that said they were extremely or very familiar of the advertised brands, it was 2 to 1 over the total US and 3 to 1 versus TV. And all across the board, audio for this particular advertised brand outperformed TV dramatically up and down the purchase funnel. Now, when we took a look at the overall category and all of the brands in the category, Media Radar and Magellan took a look at the first quarter of 2026 and looked at the ad spend, and it wasn't even close. 91% of all the money for the brands in this nasal allergy category were on TV. Only about 10% was on radio. So the spend was literally 10 to 1 on TV. However, and here's the mystery here, despite the massive TV category spend, it's the heavy audio consumers, the heavy radio, heavy podcast listeners that are much more familiar and more favorable with all of the brands in the category and more likely to be users. So let's take a look at the familiarity question here. And these are the percentage of folks who said that they were extremely or very familiar with all of the brands you see here. So let's take a look at the famous NyQuil. Well, overall, 62% of Americans say they are extremely or very familiar with NyQuil, but only 50% of heavy TV viewers. Now look at the heavy podcast listeners. 75%, 72% for heavy radio. So the heavy audio consumers way stronger awareness than the TV viewers and stronger awareness than the market overall. And if you go right down the line, Mucinex, Sudafed, Fionday, every single brand has the strongest familiarity among the heavy audio consumers, bigger than the total US and much bigger than heavy TV viewers. And now we're looking at favorability. Here are the folks that said they were very or somewhat favorable to the brand. Same exact pattern. Heavy audio consumers much more likely than the US average to be favorable for all of the brands, and way more likely than the heavy TV viewers. And what about usage consideration? You know, if you had a need, which of these brands would you consider using? Again, heavy audio consumers much more likely to consider using these brands, way more than the US general population and way more than heavy TV viewers. So what in the world is going on here? Well, the answer here is that audio users are just much bigger users of the category. The heavy TV viewers are not big users of the category. Now, some of that has to do with demography. The heavy TV viewer in America is older. TV is what's playing in God's waiting room. Small households, empty nesters, kids are long gone. Heavy audio consumers are in their 20s, 30s, 40s. Kids are in the house. Lots of, sniffles and need for medications in this category, and much bigger households. So it's just simply demography that's playing the role here. Here's the usage. Again, we see audio in the form of podcast and radio way outperforms on any usage. About 8 out of 10 heavy audio consumers have used at least one of these brands, currently use, way more than the general population and way more than the heavy TV viewer. And as you go down into the discrete brands, you see it's the same story over and over again. Heavy audio consumers much more likely to be users of the brands in this category, way more than the average and way more than the heavy TV viewers. So let's take a look at folks that are in the category that are buying brands and how you can reach them on AM/FM radio. And here are the radio programming formats that have the most frequent usage among people that are active in the category. Lots of diversity here, lots of different formats to choose from. Oldies, classic rock, rock, top 40, adult contemporary, a wide array of programming formats to build reach on. And then across podcast genres, lots of opportunity. As we saw in the Magellan spend data, there's actually very little spend from this category, the nasal and allergy category, in podcasts, and they have some of the strongest usage and awareness of all of the brands in this category. And you can see here a wide variety of genres to choose from. So we then played the actual radio ad of the advertised brands to consumers and asked them a couple of questions. First of all, the ad was much more appealing to the heavy audio consumers than to the general US overall and to the heavy TV viewers. We then looked at a series of benefits for the brand and asked for how strongly folks agreed with the ad and the benefits. And you can see again, the heavy audio consumers much more likely to be agreeing to these benefit statements about the brand, way more than the general market, way more than TV. And then consumers who were all exposed to the radio ad were asked, what kind of action would you take? Would you go online for more information, talk to friends and family, research the brands, research the category, read reviews, do purchasing either online or in the store? And across every single action, you can see the heavy podcast consumers and the heavy radio consumers much more likely to actually take action than the heavy TV viewers. So for big takeaways here from the nasal allergy brand study. Audio is the ideal platform for nasal and allergy treatments. The heavy podcast and heavy radio listeners are much more likely to be aware of, to be favorable, and use brands in the category. The campaign really knocked it out of the park. Those exposed to the campaign had much stronger brand equity than those that were unexposed. And while the TV spend in this category dwarfs audio investment 10 to 1, the brand equity and usage really underperforms among the heavy TV viewers. And as we understood, they're really not the target for this. The heavy TV viewer doesn't have kids, is older, is retired, doesn't get out a lot, doesn't get exposed to all of this stuff. So they're just not in the market for this category as much. So no matter how much money you pound on TV, it's not going to make the heavy TV viewer come into this category. Now, interestingly, these brands did exceptionally well among the heavy radio and heavy podcast consumers, despite the fact that the spending is pretty minimal on audio. Why? It's the audio consumers that are the biggest users of this category. They're much more likely to be category users and much more likely to be actual users of the dozens of brands that we studied. The Audio Active Group is a full-service audio brand advisory for national marketers. We conduct a lot of measurement for our clients, which could include brand effect, sales lift, search and site attribution, as well as creative pre-testing. Each and every week, we publish a new case study on our blog. You can find it at cumulusmedia.com or westwood1.com. And when you're there, sign up to get the free case study. Our audio insights sent directly to your email box each and every week. Thanks so much for the opportunity to take you through the nasal and allergy brand case study. Thanks so much.